Welcome back to the Truth Factory. The whole climate debate can basically be summed up with the question, is the burning of fossil fuels going to cause a global catastrophe if we don't act now? Now, on the most extreme side of the debate, the science is settled, and humanity only has a few years left to do whatever the UN says, or the Earth will be destroyed in a way that mirrors the trailer from the day after tomorrow due to the emissions created by evil humans, particularly evil Western humans who should apparently eat bugs and stop reproducing. Meanwhile, it's fine to play Helen Keller about China and India because of identity politics. On the other side, you have skeptics like myself that dare to question the Church of Anthropogenic Climatology on whether or not the sky is really about to fall on us. And I'm sure in a few years or hours, this sort of questioning will be categorized as hate speech, because the mainstream narrative goes something like this: don't question it, only listen to the scientists. Okay. Oh no, not those scientists.
How dare you!
Now, I won't deny that CO2 has risen over the past 150 years, or that humans are largely responsible for that. And I think it's reasonable to assume that increasing CO2 should have some effect on the climate, at least indirectly. My main issue with the climate debate is the political hijacking of it and the policies being made in the name of environmental action to the tune of trillions of dollars that really have nothing to do with the environment at all. We're also trying to solve an equation that could have dramatic economic impacts before we even understand all of the variables. After more than 3 decades, hundreds of millions of dollars, and countless hours invested, I can admit that prediction models have gotten more accurate, and they do a relatively good job at averaging global temperatures and ocean circulation. But there are still many chaotic fundamental processes that these models can't account for, as climate is the most complex coupled nonlinear chaotic system known to man. And CO2 is certainly not the only thing that has an effect on our climate. There's the sun, volcanoes, the tilt of the Earth's axis, water vapor, methane, clouds, ocean circulations, plate tectonics, albedo, atmospheric dust, atmospheric circulation, cosmic rays, particulates like carbon soot, forests and land use, and so much more. There has always also been an irreducible element of chaos, unknown variables, and feedbacks in Earth's climate system that no supercomputer can ever account for. And since computer models can't accurately account for most of these fundamental processes like clouds and terrestrial sink, they just basically guess, which they call parameterization. They use this $5 word because just calling it a guess would reveal that the emperor is wearing no clothes at all. For example, the only thing this climate graph is projecting is vomit. Tropospheric models projected about twice as much warming as what actually happened, which wouldn't be so bad if energy policies weren't based on model predictions rather than real temperatures. Admittedly, most surface temperature model projections are pretty good, if you forgive the fact that many temperature stations that they get their data from have been found next to things like air-conditioned exhaust vents, in asphalt parking lots, and at the end of runways being warmed with jet engine heat, all of which falsely inflate the readings, showing more warming than what is actually happening. Artificial warming from these factors was proved in a recent study a few months ago. So what percentage of warming over the last 100 years is actually from CO2 versus the changes in the measurement environment? And although you'll hear the alarmist community continually repeat how great the models are, in a study testing their accuracy, climate models perform substantially worse than a random walk formulation, with the author of the study saying that this implies that the current climate models are ill-suited for regional decadal predictions, even though they're used as inputs to policymaking. Isn't it super reassuring that the models used to make life-altering global policies could be replaced with Homer Simpson's drinking bird and have the same or a better outcome? Most models make the assumption that the Earth has a perfect natural balance, but this leads to every unknown or chaotic phenomenon being attributed to the burning of fossil fuels. It sees correlation and it makes the assumption of causation in the same way that mankind used to blame all extreme weather and bad crops on witchcraft. In fact, the most extreme witch trials happened during the Little Ice Age, orchestrated by some of the most educated and respected members of society. Under their leadership, it's estimated that up to 80,000 people across Europe were executed for witchcraft and so-called weather cooking. And the skeptics who questioned this practice were ridiculed or accused of sorcery themselves, because of course, the science was settled. There is a very good reason why the first rule of statistics is that correlation does not equal causation. because it's very easy to end up with false assumptions. For example, there is even a direct correlation between the amount the US spends on science with an increase in suicide by hanging, which is something that Jeffrey Epstein definitely did not do. There are billions of dollars in federal funding available for climate change research and technology, with funding increasing every year. Therefore, global warming needs to be a serious enough threat to justify continued large expenditures. No one hires a fireman if there are no fires, and you don't get million-dollar government grants to study non-problems. And on the flip side, prior to 2008, a handful of skeptical groups were given a cumulative few $1,000,000 from ExxonMobil and Koch Industries. Receiving funding either way does not necessarily invalidate scientific results, and I'd like to err on the side of positive thinking and believe that the vast majority of scientists are honest. But until we can fund science without the risk of artificially promoting bias, it's understandable to be skeptical of anyone whose paycheck directly depends on what version of the truth comes out of their mouth, especially when that's used to influence energy policies. This brings me to the infamous hockey stick graph created by Michael Mann, Bradley, and Hughes. This graph shows the global surface temperature remaining approximately constant for nearly 1,000 years, and then rising abruptly from 1900, showing that the warming in the 20th century is due almost entirely to the increase of atmospheric greenhouse gases, and that modern warming is unprecedented. This instantly became the go-to graph for the International Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. The obvious issue here is that it's wrong. Man's hockey stick literally flattened history by erasing the medieval warming period and the Little Ice Age. This is ironically a true example of man-made global warming. If your goal is to establish that today's warming is completely unprecedented in recorded history, all you have to do is eliminate any evidence of warming in the last 1,000 years for entirely natural reasons. In 2004, this graph finally received much-needed criticism for the artificial creation of the hockey stick shape due to incorrect statistical analysis. It turns out that the hockey stick shape could only be created after cherry-picking through hundreds of samples and only using those that gave them the picture that they wanted. For example, they derived all of the temperatures over the 15th century from looking at a single tree. To quote a tree reconstructor who worked with Michael Mann, "You have to pick cherries if you want to make a cherry pie." If we compare the hockey stick graph to one created by Jungquist with data from 120 proxy records from all over the world, we see a much different and likely more accurate version of natural climate variation, 3 to 4 times larger than in Mann's graph. But the IPCC already knew this, as the medieval warming period and the Little Ice Age can clearly be found here in the first IPCC assessment, published in 1991, that would later be replaced with the hockey stick graph. Because real data is irrelevant to an industry driven by making fake doomsday predictions.
You don't ask, is the science right? You ask, should we have carbon credits?
Speaking of which, in 2009, emails were leaked from the Climatic Research Unit at the University of East Anglia from some of the leading names in global warming research. This was known as ClimateGate. One such correspondence is from Phil Jones, director of the CRU, who wrote to hockey stick Michael Mann, in an email labeled highly confidential. I can't see either of these papers being in the next IPCC report. Kevin and I will keep them out somehow, even if we have to redefine what the peer review literature is. Seemingly, the scientists did not want to consider studies that challenge the view that global warming is man-made. Kevin Trenberth to Michael Mann. The fact is, we can't account for the lack of warming at the moment, and it's a travesty that we can't. Our observing system is inadequate. So rather than admit they're wrong, it's better to blame reality.
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the
Scientific observations.
No, we're wrong.
If anything, these people are the real climate deniers. As you can see, ClimateGate appeared to show a few influential IPCC scientists trying to manipulate data and also interfering with the peer review process to keep skeptical papers out of scientific journals. Follow-up investigations found the scientists to be innocent of any wrongdoing, but the same could be said about Hillary Clinton's emails, which literally talked about making sacrifices to Moloch. So if nothing else, reading through the ClimateGate emails certainly paints a negative picture of a culture full of groupthink and self-righteous intolerance to criticism. In 2017, ClimateGate 2 Electric Boogaloo hit. when a whistleblower named Dr. John Bates exposed that the world's leading source of climate data, the NOAA, purposely published a sensationalized, flawed report exaggerating global warming using misleading and unverified data. This report was rushed to publication right in time to influence the outcome of the Paris Agreement. The report claimed that the pause or slowdown in global warming in the period since 1998 that the IPCC's models failed to predict never existed, and that world temperatures had been rising faster than scientists expected. Now, thermometer records showed that warming basically stopped from 1998 to 2014 until they didn't. As you can see, there is a major difference between the actual observed temperatures and the ones that these scientists were trying to push. It's also odd that these climate organizations were denying that the pause existed while simultaneously proposing dozens of excuses to explain it. This shows that the policy debate surrounding global warming is not grounded in science anymore, and that systematic deceit is not a bug, it's a feature of these organizations. In fact, big climate change panels like the NOAA and the IPCC have become nothing more than political lobbying organizations masquerading as scientific bodies. This was made even more apparent with Judithgate. It turns out that the IPCC's extremely important report of the influence of the sun on the climate relied on only one solar physicist named Judith Lean, who has been linked to controversial manipulation of solar activity graphs in the past. Even worse is that Judith was backing up the assertions in the report with a single paper, in which Judith is a co-author. Now, I was going to go through all of the climate scandals one by one, but there are far too many, as you can see here. If global warming was as imminent and dangerous as the IPCC claimed, there would be no need to manipulate data or cherry-pick scientists. It's easy to say that the science is settled if your source is only one scientist, one paper, or one tree. And it's these controversies that gives us the perception that the global warming establishment has willfully engaged in a campaign to mislead the public. Perhaps they did it with the best of intentions. Maybe they believe that the dangers of anthropogenic global warming are so great that misleading the public with hyperbole is justified. But if it really was that bad, you wouldn't have to exaggerate. So reports get published showing scary extreme scenarios, and the anxiety is not lost on the media that is completely unrestrained in the use of doomsday imagery and biblical language as it amplifies and manipulates the studies further for the sake of clickbait. Because headlines like, "Yeah, actually it's not quite as bad as we originally thought," doesn't get quite as much attention as "human civilization will crumble by 2050 if we don't stop climate change." Here are some examples of exaggerated claims over the years that did not come to fruition. In 1979, experts said increased atmospheric carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels would cause the cooling of the United States by 16 degrees. In fact, there'd be so much cooling that we would be entering an ice age in 200 years. Wow, if only we listened to them 40 years ago, we could have prevented ourselves from freezing to death. And then acid rain became a threat, but don't worry, $100 million from the federal government should fix it. In 1988, it was said that rising sea levels could completely cover the Maldives in 30 years. In 1989, a senior environmental officer from the United Nations said entire nations would be wiped off the face of the earth if global warming is not reversed by the year 2000. That deadline has now been pushed to 2020, which is getting pretty close. It was also predicted that Lower Manhattan would be underwater by 2018. In 2008, NASA scientists predicted that the Arctic would be ice-free by 2018, which is something Al Gore said would happen by 2014. And these scientists predict it would happen in 2015, this one says 2016, 2017. In 1989, The Guardian said that the only way to stop 12 feet of sea level rise was global communism. The UN said that there would be 50 million environmental refugees by 2010. In 2004, the Pentagon told Bush that climate change would destroy us by 2020. Too much snow, not enough snow, drought, and the only habitable place to live will be Antarctica. So then credulous politicians use these sensationalized headlines in order to convince people that it's a good idea to impose things like a carbon tax, which have been so popular they've led to deadly riots. A good example of this is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who hyperbolically and incorrectly claimed that we're all going to die in 12 years if we don't do something now.
The world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change.
And as she said again, while building furniture.
How many years until the world ends again? We have 12 years left to cut emissions by at least 50%, if not more. And for everyone who wants to make a joke about that, you may laugh.
Bartender turned politician AOC is best known for sponsoring the Green New Deal, an environmental policy created in a weekend not by climate scientists, but by people with degrees in gender and sexuality studies, which is why it's peppered with socialist nonsense like repairing historical oppression and giving money to those who are unwilling to work. At the end of the day, none of these people seemingly actually care about the environment or science. Even the Extinction Rebellion leader says it's not about climate. Of course not. The real enemy is toxic old white European racist heterosexuals. I'm surprised that the IPCC hasn't made a graph correlating toxic masculinity to temperature change, since it's easy to make a plotted graph out of 3 random data points and not only prove causation, but pretend that we can predict the future. Even worse is the Paris Agreement that everyone promotes as the greatest thing since sliced Jell-O, but almost no one has actually read except for me and like 4 other people, including those who wrote it. It reads like baby's first globalist manifesto, by stating things like, when taking action to address climate change, we should also promote the empowerment of women. Yeah, we don't need coal power, we just need girl power. With the Paris Agreement, industrial first world nations are supposed to give $100 billion a year to developing nations like India and China to lower their emissions by investing in green technology, without any guarantee that it will do anything. And there is no penalization if countries don't keep their promises, which by the way, almost none of them have. They're probably just going to go buy booze and cigarettes with it anyway. But here's the math. Even if every government on the planet not only keeps every Paris promise, reduces all emissions by 2030, and keeps their emission reductions throughout the rest of the century, which they're already failing to do, temperatures will be reduced by just 0.17 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. And that's only based on the assumption that the climate models are accurate. In the meantime, the Paris Pact is estimated to have a $100 trillion price tag. If human action is not causing climate change, the Paris Agreement is irrelevant. If it is, then the Paris Agreement is an obstacle to actual solutions. You'd have about the same outcome by paying Justin Trudeau to do a rain dance, and you know he already has an outfit picked out for it because he eats cultural appropriation for breakfast. But why wouldn't we just blindly trust the government, though? They would never lie to us, right? But let's follow the money trail. A few years ago, a propaganda campaign against Alberta oil sands and tourism began. It was spearheaded by a company called Corp Ethics, which created an anti-tar sands campaign, which was funded by the Rockefeller brothers. Yes, the same Rockefeller family that got tremendously wealthy because of oil. Now, around the time of the Iraq War and California energy crisis in 2003 to 2004, the Rockefellers strategized how to get control of the United States domestic energy policy. First, they sold off their investments in oil and coal and bought into alternative energy, including investing over $100 million into a company called Mainstream Renewable Power. The oil barons became the oil Karens, and they want to talk to your manager. According to a leaked memo from a secret Rockefeller meeting, their agenda was to wage war on oil companies, in particular Exxon. Among their tactics was manufacturing a scandal and applying as much political pressure as possible to get investors to divest from oil companies. Part of this plan for energy domination also included keeping Canada's oil out of the global market. Over $90 million over the last decade, bankrolled by the Rockefellers and several other pro-green foundations, have been funneled to media and climate groups to oppose Alberta's oil industry, including to Indigenous populations that oppose the Keystone Pipeline. Even celebrity spokespeople like Leonardo DiCaprio were involved. They even funded a questionable study to give their campaign the air of scientific legitimacy. And all of this was then used to influence Obama not to build the pipeline. If this was really about the environment, why would they go after a country with a cap on emissions, a carbon tax, and one of the largest forested areas in the world? Because the only thing the Rockefellers really care about greening is their wallets. They are mere opportunists who only sponsor climate alarmism in order to enhance their leverage in the global arena. The Rockefellers and the Rothschilds did pretty much the same thing in the 1970s when they used a shadowy energy cartel to artificially inflate the price of uranium and drive out competition. And then they hired an environmental propaganda group who used several celebrities to very successfully taint public opinion of nuclear energy. Since then, the Rockefellers have used the guise of environmentalism in order to control the energy arena. In fact, the person who founded the UN Climate Initiative was Maurice Strong, who was a Rockefeller protege and self-described socialist, who, like the Rockefellers, made his fortune in oil and gas before turning on it. The Rockefeller Foundation to this day works very closely with the UNFCCC, the same organization that created the Paris Agreement. And while this is merely conspiratorial, the Rockefellers seem to have their eyes on South Africa, which is extremely rich in high-quality rare earth minerals, something that many modern technologies need and renewable energy technology cannot function without. This includes wind turbines, solar panels, batteries for celebrities' Teslas, and much more. This is the new oil. But let me put it to you like this. If you want to make money off of your green energy, all you have to do is crush the competition by making all of their energy sources seem as undesirable as possible. Then you pay people to pressure the government to cripple those industries. And then you create a market for your product by shadow puppeting the UN Climate Division into creating a wealth redistribution scam where tax dollars from first world countries go to highly populated developing nations to go green. And the best part is, they get to do this under the guise of being climate heroes. Mainstream renewable power had record profits last year of over $500 million. Meanwhile, since the Canadian oil industry was crippled, suicide rates in Alberta have increased by 30% due to mass oil-field layoffs. The green industry has a dark underbelly that needs to be exposed. I'm not saying that the whole thing is a scam, I'm just saying that those who are pushing the climate agenda the hardest are those with the most to gain from it. But nobody wants to question this due to bad optics. You'll get called a science denier and get hit with a 97% consensus meme as if appeal to authority is an actual argument. The 97% figure comes from a few very obscure, cherry-picked surveys and a handful of papers. One of the most recent and suspicious 97% studies was conducted by John Cook, a blogger and self-proclaimed cartoonist. Cook lumped together those who believe that humans are the main cause and those who believe that human action likely has some effect on the climate. If you look at the raw data, this is what you get. The 64 who think the main cause is human is 1.6%, not 97% as was propagated. Also, several scientists whose papers were included in the initial sample had protested that they had been misrepresented, including Dr. Richard Toll, who said, "I think your data is a load of crap." But the purpose of these reports isn't to present facts. The purpose is to taint the public's perception of climate skeptics by intentionally inflating data to create a false argument of authority. And it worked because appeal to consensus still remains the most common argument when debating this subject, even though it's not an argument at all.
Not an argument.
It's an excuse not to debate someone who is questioning the validity of your claims. Here's a great example.
Is it correct that the satellite data over the last 18 years demonstrate no significant warming?
No.
How is it incorrect?
Based upon our experts, it's been refuted long ago, and it's not up for scientific debate.
Because the computer models say there should be dramatic warming, and yet the actual satellites taking the measurement don't show any significant warming.
But Senator, 97% of the scientists concur and agree that there is global warming and anthropogenic impact with regards to
the problem with that statistic that gets cited a lot is it's based on one bogus study. And indeed, your response, I would point that your response is quite striking. I asked about the science and the evidence, the actual data. We have satellites. They're measuring temperature. That should be relevant. And your answer was, pay no attention to your lying eyes and the numbers that the satellites show. Instead, listen to the scientists who are receiving massive grants who tell us Do not debate the science.
And you're asking me if we take the 3% over the 97%?
No, I'm actually not asking about a survey among scientists. I'm asking about the objective data.
Also, if you don't agree with these mean girls, you can't sit with them.
There is enormous pressure for climate scientists to conform to the so-called consensus. This pressure comes not only from politicians, but from federal funding agencies, universities and professional societies, and scientists themselves who are green activists. Reinforcing this consensus are strong monetary, reputational, and authority interests. Policy advocacy, when combined with understating the uncertainties, risks destroying science's reputation for honesty and objectivity, without which scientists become regarded as merely another lobbyist group.
Scientists should be able to be skeptical without punishment. History is full of cases where the majority of the scientific community has been wrong or confused. Here are many examples. If it weren't for skeptics, we would still be measuring the bumps on our skull to predict mental traits, or we would still be burning witches for bad weather. Consensus, especially politically driven consensus, has nothing to do with scientific validity, and using it as an argument has been historically dangerous. Scientific statements can be tested and proven wrong or right, and until a statement can be proven, it is merely a theory or opinion. Science is not settled by groupthink, it thrives on debate. It lives by argument and counter-argument and should reward those that break the status quo, not punish them, like the professor who was fired for talking about how the polar bears are doing great. But I guess the mainstream Ministry of Truth wants you to be distracted by thinking about sad dead polar bears instead of why your tax dollars are going to China. But what about the 11,000 scientists who signed off on that emergency climate agreement? The list of names even included Mickey Mouse and Dumbledore, so you know it must be pretty serious when fictional characters start weighing in. And I'd really love to get the opinion of the customer service rep from Domino's. In this document, it also talks about lowering populations in first world countries. Perhaps the UN will consult with China for help since they have a great track record of killing millions of their own people. But that would involve actually addressing China, so that will work. Natural population growth in first world countries is already low and declining. Rapid population growth is only really happening in third world countries. If scientists really cared about this, they would be promoting the end of massive third world immigration to first world countries as a way to lower the carbon footprint. So the climate alarmists need to ask themselves if so-called saving the world is more important than political correctness. But it bears repeating that this is not really about saving the world. Even if I can see that there's a possibility that anthropogenic plant food could be causing rapid warming, I'm highly suspicious that a group of people are telling us that the only way to prevent a global catastrophe is to give them more money and power to perform climate magic that is mathematically impossible, all while they sit there in their coastal mansions which should be under the water already if Al Gore was right, including Al Gore, who bought an $8 million beachfront property with the money he made from making fake climate predictions. There are real environmental issues out there like deforestation and massive heaps of garbage filling up our oceans and turning cities into landfills. Everyone should be concerned about the upkeep and purity of their food and water supply that's currently being poisoned by endocrine-disrupting pesticides. There are several realistic actions that we can take to clean up the real problems our world is facing. But if man-made climate change were a real threat, there would be only one real solution. And it's not driving a Prius or eating bugs, it's Soylent Green.
We got to start eating babies.
I'm just kidding, it's nuclear energy. Nuclear is the most carbon-neutral energy source per kilowatt hour. And it's a far better investment for the environment than the trillions going into the Paris Agreement. And despite most people's presumption of it, due to that propaganda campaign in the 70s by those with competing energy interests, it's actually incredibly clean and safe when people aren't purposely being stupid with it or building plants directly on fault lines. While it's not perfect, nothing is, it's a good interim solution to a problem that likely isn't even real.
A lot of it's a hoax. It's a hoax. I mean, it's a money-making industry, okay?
But until little Greta and all the scientists start advocating for that, along with criticizing the Paris Agreement, limiting mass third world immigration, and trying to have a conversation with a giant panda in the room, I don't believe any of their bullshit. So yeah, I guess it's fair to say that I'm a bit skeptical of the mainstream climate narrative and their agenda, but I'll leave my sources in the description and you can decide for yourself. Thank you so much for watching. Obviously, this is a bit of a longer video, it took me a long time to make. If you appreciate it, there are links in the description to support me, or you can just share, like, and subscribe. Thank you so much and have a great night. Meow!